Ed was saying, we have been studying the letter of Romans together with our sister church in Spokane for the past few weeks. How many weeks has there been? Like maybe 6, 7?
I think this is week 6, yes.
Yeah, week 6. And so obviously this letter is written by Paul, the apostle, and there are 16 chapters in this book. But Paul did not know that there were 16 chapters because back then there was no chapters. So what I want to say is that there are many different ways that we can divide this book into different sections. But I think the simplest way is actually to put it into 2 major sections. So the first 11 chapters is Paul talking about a big story, a theology, if you will. And then after that, on chapter 12, all the way to the end, would be practical advices on how to live a Christian life, you know. So if you like practical stuff, it's coming next week. But today, it's going to be a bit heavy on the theology side of it, okay? So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I think the question that we are asking today is a rather important one, a fundamental question that I think is concerning every one of us here. And the question is, if Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15, he said, I am sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And if all his disciples were Jews, then how come you and I, we Gentiles, are in his church? And this is exactly what Paul is discussing in Romans chapter 11, which is our lesson for today. And I think depending on your background, what I'm going to discuss today might be slightly different from what you have learned before. But I think whatever we might learn today, in the end, we'll find out that what Paul wants us to know is that we are not going to be arrogant about it. So I'll start for myself on that. So here we are at the, like I said, you know, if you divide the book of Romans into 2 chapters, the first part is about stories and theology. We are here at this final chapter. You can say the climax of the theological section of the letter of Romans. So I think at this point, it is necessary for me to just do a quick summary of the past 10 chapters up to this point. And I'll do it as quick as I know how to, okay? If we have to pick just one word for the book of Romans, I think many people will pick the word faith, all right? And I know, like, we are modern Christians. We like to look up dictionaries because we like word definitions. Like, you know, we like to ask questions like, what is faith? And then we have a definition for it. But when you read Romans, you won't find any definition. You won't, because that's not how Paul thinks. He just talked on and on and on about faith, but without ever giving us any definition. Instead, he used examples. He used positive examples, negative examples to describe the behaviors and the consequences around acting faithfully or the opposite, you know, being unfaithful. So first, he began with a negative example, starting all the way back in chapter 1. He talked about all of us, human beings. We broke faith with God.
Hey, Claude, glad you made it.
Come on in.
So back in chapter 1, he talked about all of us, human beings. We broke faith with God. How? Because we abandoned the calling that God made us for, which is to be his agent, to be sort of his housekeeper on this earth, in his creation. And so by doing that, by breaking faith, we damage our relationship with God, and we also abuse his creations for our own pleasures. We deprive the creation of its caretakers. And for this, Paul said in chapter 8, verse 19, he said, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. It's still waiting for human beings to live up to that standard. And Paul said, So for us to be restored, for the creation to be restored, first of all, we have to stop going down this wrong direction. We have to turn back to learn to be faithful, learn to act faithfully to God and to our human responsibilities. So that's the negative example. And then Paul went to the positive example. He gave one example in chapter 4. He started talking about Abraham. He said, Abraham trusted in God's promise to give him many offsprings, despite the fact that he was very old in his age. And so here Paul cited the story in Genesis chapter 15, and in 15 verse 6, which says, he believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. And I want to just unpack this real quick a little bit. So, first question, who believed the Lord? It was
Abraham.
pretty obvious, right? You know, the Lord doesn't have to believe himself. So, he believed the Lord. Abraham believed the Lord. That's obvious. But the next sentence, it says, he credited to him as righteousness. Who credited to whom as righteousness?
God credited Abraham.
God credited to Abraham as righteousness. And that is the common and agreed upon reading by most Christians and Jews. All right? But the Hebrew simply says, he considered him righteous. He considered him righteous. So it could very well be the other way around. That Abraham thought God was righteous because God made a big promise for him. And in fact, Nachmanides, a very famous biblical commentator of the 13th century, he preferred this way of reading. And we don't have to argue who is right, who is wrong. Because the point is, scriptures is so rich because it has multiple layers of meaning. And so we can put those together and say that first, Abraham recognized God's righteousness for the promise that God gave him. And in Paul's language, in last chapter, chapter 10, he would say Abraham surrendered to God's righteousness by trusting God, that God is trustworthy for the promise that God promised. This trusting is a choice that we have to make, and it takes courage. And therefore, because of his act of trust and faith to God, God credited to Abraham for his righteousness. So this is what we actually talked about last week when we said, what is faith in God? To have faith in God is to have faith in the faithfulness of God, right? And also last week we talked about chapter 9 all the way to chapter 11 is Paul's theology or his teaching about Israel. And we talked about the story of Israel a little bit, but the question is, why Israel? Why did God choose Israel? That was exactly the same question that Moses asked the Israelites to think about. Why you? What's so special about you? So in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7 to 8, Moses told the Israelites, it is not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all people. Meaning, but if we go by numbers, if you go by size, Israel, you're just too small for the job that God has in mind to accomplish. So then why you, Israel? Moses continued to say, it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors. Why did God choose Israel? Because God kept his promise to Abraham. Abraham, the promise that Abraham believed 400 years ago, and Abraham is long dead. And now God kept his promise. So I think if we call ourselves the spiritual descendants of Abraham, we have to think about the fact that Abraham was willing to trust God on a promise that was way bigger than his own lifetime. And I think that puts a whole new meaning, a whole new level of challenge of what it means to have faith, doesn't it? And so out of God's faithfulness to Abraham, God adopted Israel as his own children, which is what Paul said in chapter 9. To Israel belongs the adoption. And so God is like an adoptive father to Israel, and he continued to stay faithful like a good adopted father, despite that Israel has been a rebellious child a lot of the times. And last week we looked at this video of the pottery. God is like a faithful potter working with clay, and we saw how stubborn clay can be. But God never stopped working with the clay, never stopped improvising on the clay to make it into something that is glorious, useful, and delighting God. Of course, we talked about all these about Israel. The reason why we know this dynamic between God and Israel is because of the Old Testament. We got all this from the Old Testament. So we have to understand that no other people on earth actually write about their own history in such a self-critical and such a sober way as the biblical Israel. And therefore, we said last week that the story of Israel has become the forerunner of our Christian faith. And we learn that to have faith is more than just to have a set of solid doctrines that we stand on. That is good. But to have faith actually means to have the courage to just go on in life and go on an adventure with God. There will be ups and downs, there will be struggles, and there will be a lot of growing pain. But that is what the name Israel means. Israel means the one who struggles with God. And so that sums up the first 10 chapters of Romans. And I think now we are ready to go on to our lesson today, chapter 11 of Romans, the climax of Paul's theology. And here I want to do things a little bit out of order here. If you go in chapter 11, you can flip to the page there if you like. You don't have to. I'll do things a little out of order here. I'll just begin with verse 20 of chapter 11, where Paul said, "They were broken off on account of unbelief, but you stand on account of belief. So do not become arrogant, but be afraid." So first of all, let's talk about how not to read this, or what this doesn't mean. It is rather common, for whatever reason, that when we read this, a lot of times we assume what Paul was saying was that Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah were broken off from God. And not only is this kind of mindset a hotbed of hatred, which we talked about last week, but I would argue that if we read it this way, we misrepresent Paul completely. Because there are two major misconceptions that we have. The first misconception was that Jews during Paul's time did not accept Jesus as Messiah. But Paul said it very clearly in the book of Galatians, chapter 2, that Peter's mission was to the Jews. Paul's mission was to the Gentiles. And both of them were successful. There's a story in Acts chapter 21 where Paul went back to Jerusalem and reported to James about his mission to the Gentiles. And here, Acts 21 verse 20, it says, "They heard it and they praised God." They heard Paul's story, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law." So what does it say? There are thousands upon thousands of Jewish believers of Jesus, and they're all passionate about their Jewish traditions and rituals, just like how Paul was. And that brings me to our second big misconception, which is that Jewish traditions are standing in the way of the gospel. Therefore, Jews must give up their tradition to follow Jesus. This is a big misconception. Because in this same story, in the next verse, James' people told Paul, they, meaning the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise the children or observe the customs. So they're telling Paul, you better get ready to defend yourself. So what did Paul do when he learned about these false allegations? He took a Nazirite vow in the temple as a preparation to defend his own innocence. And the Nazirite vow is a special kind of vow that we can find in Numbers chapter 6. But we don't have to go into the details except to know that it is a very serious vow that a person makes before God. So putting all these together, don't we realize that if we think and we preach that Paul gave up his Jewish traditions in order to follow Jesus, or he was telling other Jews to do the same thing, we are just participating in the same kind of slandering against him, just like those Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. It was a false allegation back then. It will still be a false allegation now if we say the same thing. And moreover, we will imply that Paul actually blatantly lied to God, that he would make a vow to defend his innocence, even though he knew that he gave up his Jewish traditions. We would be implying that he was lying to God. So these are serious allegations to make against Paul if we hold on to these kind of stereotypes. And like I said, I don't know, for whatever reasons, these are quite common in teachers of the Bible. I just hope that we can start to see some corrections in these misconceptions. So to summarize, Jewish traditions were not in the way of the gospel, and there were many Jewish Christians in Paul's time. Therefore, it is unlikely that what we just read would mean that Jews did not believe in Jesus were cut off from God. So if that's not what he meant, what did Paul mean when he say they were broken off on the account of unbelief? The first question is, who is they? Last week we already talked about this. When Paul was writing chapter 9 to 11, he was not thinking about Jews of his time only. He was thinking about Israel, of the entire history, all 12 tribes of Israel. They means Israel. And many of them, it was for Israel that was for over 1,000 years before Paul. And then there's the other word that was translated in English as unbelief. But the word unbelief in Greek was apistia. Here in this phrase, in this verse is apistia, which is the opposite of pistia. It's just like in English, the word amoral is the opposite of moral. So if pistia means faith or faithfulness, apistia means what? The opposite of it, unfaithful. So we can actually read this verse in this way, that they, meaning the entire house of Israel, were broken off. They went on the exile on account of being unfaithful to God. And this recalls a crazy vision that God gave to Ezekiel the prophet. In Ezekiel chapter 37, God showed Ezekiel a big pile of dry human bones. And he said, "Son of man, these bones are the entire house of Israel. And see, they say, our bones are dried out, our hope is lost, and we are completely cut off." The entire house of Israel was completely cut off, and they're in pain. I know this vision is a bit dramatic, Halloween is over. But it captures the kind of anguish and the pain of going into exile. In other words, Paul was actually still remembering the painful memory of his people, which is recorded in the Old Testament, which is the history book, if you will. And this painful exile that afflicted the entire house of Israel. Like he said in chapter 9, verse 2 to 4, he said, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from God, from Christ, for the sake of my own brothers and sisters, my own flesh and blood, and they are the Israelites." Why was he so sad? The reason why he was so sad was the exile never ended. Why? Because the majority of the 12 tribes of Israel were lost forever. You might say, wait, hang on a second. Didn't we read in, Ezra and Nehemiah that the Jews came back from exile, they rebuilt the temple? Well, yes and no. We already said it last week that by the time of Paul, by the time of Jesus, there were only 2 out of the 12 tribes of the whole house of Israel that are still recognizable. They are the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And where did the other 10 tribes go? Nobody knows. Because after a few hundred years in exile, which happened a few hundred years before Paul's time, so after a few hundred years, by the time of Paul, the other 10 tribes, they've been living in those whatever places they were for a few hundred years, and they have been completely assimilated into the local cultures, local people. Has anybody done any genetic tests that tell you your ancestry? Anybody done that? Anybody? If you care to share, did you find anything surprising, unexpected in your ancestry at all?
I would say for me how much of Africa or African I actually had in my system.
Did you know that before?
I thought I was more towards the line of the Northern European, Spain, Portugal
Right.
area.
Right.
At least through family context and the early family tree,
Right.
I should say.
Yeah.
It was there, and I do have some of that, but I believe it was about 25%
Okay.
was actually from the Bantu tribe.
So did you ever identify as African in your whole life? And you still don't. So that's the point. That's the point, is that assimilation is the normal thing that happens in human migrations, right? You know, you just give it enough time. Eventually, people will assimilate into the dominant culture, the dominant gene pool of wherever we live. And we lost trace of the culture, the memory of where we came from. That's normal. And that's what happened to the 10 tribes. And therefore, it's kind of a miracle, if you think about it, that there are people like Paul and Jesus, they still remember that they were Jews after a few hundred years of being in exile and come back. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. But still, the rest of Israel were lost forever. They were Paul's own flesh and blood. They were family, except that they have been completely cut off from the family, which is why Paul was so sad when you think about this. And so we can say, for all intents and purposes, the original Israel was dead. And this bothered Paul a lot. And I think this should bother us as well. Why? Because this puts into question whether God's words are trustworthy. And we know that Jesus himself taught us to take our own words seriously. We have heard his Sermon on the Mount where he said, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Sounds very good. But what about his own promise to Israel? What about his own promise to the church? What about his own promise to Joshua that says, I will not fail you or forsake you? Or his promise at the end of the book of Matthew, he says, I am with you always to the end of age. What about all these promises? Can we trust God's promises if Israel is gone forever? So Paul himself, he wanted so much to believe. Like he said in verse 29 of today's chapter, he said the calling of God is irrevocable. He's talking about the calling of Israel, except that Israel is gone forever. Therefore, at the very beginning of chapter 11, Paul had to ask this question. He asked, has God rejected his people? And his first answer to his own question was no, because he said, well, look around, there are still some faithful Jews like Jesus, like myself, like Paul, right? He said, so there are still some faithful Jews, and he used the story of the prophet Elijah and the 7,000 remnants to illustrate this point. There are still so-called remnants around. But if you have the faith of Paul, then saving only the remnant is just not going to cut it. It's not enough, because a remnant is what it is. A remnant is a remnant. A remnant is just the remainders, what's left over. So whichever you look at it, it still looks like God has rejected his people. We know the famous parable about the lost sheep. If 1 out of 100 sheep was lost and we have 99 remain, what would a good shepherd do? Go find that one lost one. And rejoice after you find the one lost one. So therefore, Paul take God's promise very seriously. And here we have to go back to that crazy vision about the dry bones that God showed the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 37 of Ezekiel. It says, Son of man, these bones are the entire house of Israel. And see, they say, our bones are dried out, our hope is lost, and we are completely cut off. But God continued to tell Ezekiel, you go prophesy to them. Go say to them, says the Lord, see, I am opening up your graves. And when I lift you out of your graves, my people, I will put my breath into you, and you will come to life. And I will set you upon your soil, and you will know that I am the Lord. So God promised Ezekiel that the entire house of Israel will somehow be resurrected, will be recreated from dead. And this is what Paul believed, which is why he said in verse 15, for if their rejection, meaning if Israel going into exile, is the reconciliation of the world, then imagine what will their acceptance be but what? But life from the dead. This is what Paul said in verse 15. So therefore, not a single sheep shall be lost, not a single tribe shall be forgotten. And this is Paul's theology of Israel in chapter 11. But that still begs the question, how is this going to happen? How is God going to restore the lost 10 tribes if they have been completely blended into into Gentiles that you cannot tell them apart anymore? How is God going to even find them? How are the missionaries going to go find them? So here in verse 26, Paul quoted Isaiah 59 saying, out of Zion will come the Redeemer, and he will banish ungodliness from Jacob. Jacob is just another name for Israel. So Paul is quoting Isaiah saying, a Redeemer will come from Zion to redeem the house of Israel. And we Christians, just like Paul, we accept that Jesus is the Redeemer that comes out of Zion. So by quoting Isaiah, Paul was saying that Jesus will redeem the entire house of Israel. The gospel of Jesus will restore all 12 tribes, even the tribes that are lost forever. Now that's a crazy idea, it's a lofty idea. How exactly will that play out? That's what Paul is trying to tell us in this chapter. And this has to do with Paul's own calling, which he told us the story of his calling in Acts 22. Verse 17 to verse 21, Paul was telling a story of his encounter with Jesus. He said, after I had returned to Jerusalem, which is like shortly after he got baptized, after I returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus. Then he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. He saw a vision of Jesus in the temple, which is the house of God. So he had a vision of God, and God told him, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. Who else in the Bible had the same experience? Who else in the Bible had a vision of God in the temple? It was Isaiah, the prophet. In chapter 6 of Isaiah, he had a vision of God in the temple, and God asked, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah said, me, Hineni, shlacheni. Here I am, send me. But there's a difference. God sent Isaiah to announce judgment. God sent Isaiah to announce to Israel that they would be scattered among the nations. That was Isaiah. Now, he is calling Paul to go to the nations to gather them back. But like we said, the lost tribes are lost. We cannot tell them apart anymore. They are like dry bones buried among the Gentiles. They are, we cannot tell whether a person is, the original Israelite or not. Therefore, since this is already what happened, the lost 10 tribes are now Gentiles. God will bring in all the Gentiles into his house to fulfill his promise to restore the entire house of Israel. And this is why Jesus sent Paul to proclaim his gospel to all the nations, to all the Gentiles. Did Paul understand his mission? Yes, he did. He said in verse 25 of chapter 11 here, he says, until the full number of Gentiles has come in this way, all Israel will be saved. I know how this sounds like. It sounds a bit different from the story that we've been told. The story of gospel that we've been told usually revolved around, our personal moral failures and our personal salvation, our personal ticket to the heaven. We never really think much about the resurrection of Israel. But I can assure you that we are not looking at different stories here. Our individual little stories belong to the bigger story. Here in verse 30 to 31, Paul wanted to explain to us how we belong to the bigger story. He says, just as you, meaning you Gentiles, were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, meaning Israel's disobedience, so also they, meaning Israel, have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you Gentiles, they also may now receive mercy. What is Paul saying here? Paul is famous for this twisting, turning of sentences, but what is Paul saying here? He's saying that Israel, as we have seen in the Old Testament, for the past thousands of years, Israel participated in the same kind of ungodliness as the Gentiles around them. And this is why Paul said in Romans chapter 3:23, he says, all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. I think many Christians know this verse very well. This is also what we read a few weeks ago. Israel participated in the same ungodliness as all the Gentiles around. But let's not forget also that we just saw what Moses told Israelites. You are the fewest of all peoples. You are the smallest of peoples. Which means that the vast majority of the people on earth are the Gentiles. Which also means that the vast majority of the nonsense and the sin that are done are by Gentiles. But we know Israel has received a punishment in the form of the exile, while the Gentiles are basically going free. It's just like if you have two people who have done the same crime. The first person is serving his sentence and showing remorse, whereas the second person is still running around free of any consequences. Then one day, the judge decides that it's time for mercy. Then I ask you, who of these two people should receive mercy first? Is the one serving the sentence or the one still running around free of consequences? The second one. The one is free of consequences. Well, respectfully disagree. I think it should be the mercy should go to the person that is serving the sentence, already received the punishment, right? It's just like how in Isaiah chapter 40, this is written to the Israelites or Jews in exile. Isaiah 40 says, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." Yet, here we are. We know that we are Christians. We have learned the gospel. We have now received the mercy. And Paul is telling us Gentiles, don't you know that the mercy that you received was meant for Israel that has served her sentence twice over, who are still in exile? And this is why, in going back to the beginning of last, I was saying that Paul wanted us to not be arrogant. Because as we read through the entire chapter of 11, we saw Paul repeatedly saying, Gentile believers, do not become arrogant just because now you have received grace from God. He's telling us, Gentile believers, do not be prideful, but be reminded that God adopted us because God was faithful. to his promise to Israel. Just as what Moses was telling the Israelites. God adopted you, Israelites, because God was faithful to his promise to Abraham. So in the end, it goes all the way back to God's original promise to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 is where we first saw Abraham coming on the scene of history. So out of this generation that built the Tower of Babel, God called Abraham and God told him, go from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will become a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse. And through you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So you see, because God kept his promise to Abraham, he redeemed Israel from Egypt. And then God kept his promise to Israel. He redeemed the whole world, all of us, from ourselves, actually.
Yeah.
So praise be to God, because from the beginning to the end, God has kept his promise to Abraham. God is trustworthy. And this God is the God that said before Abraham was, I am. And his name is Jesus. Amen?
Amen.
And so with that, we have concluded the first section of Romans, which is about theology, about stories. Next week, we will begin reading Paul's practical suggestions on how to live a faithful life that is worthy of the name of Christ. And, oh, thank you, Ed. We can start to get ready for our communion. I don't know about you, but thank you, Ed. When I was getting ready for this study, it was extremely humbling to me. Because I remember I first began to show interest in the Christian faith in 1999. Manjai was there, so she can, I have witnessed. And so it's been 25 years. And looking back, I spent a lot of energy trying to figure out what is the right kind of Christian faith. You know, what is the right way to study the Bible? What is the right way to pray? What is the right theology about God? What is the right theology about salvation? You know, on and on and on. And to a certain extent, I think this, you know, effort, fruitless or otherwise, has never stopped. So on the bright side, it has motivated me a lot to keep learning. But I think on the darker side, I have to wonder, what if one day I finally figure out everything? What if, or I just feel like I have figured out everything? Then what's going to happen to people who do not agree with me? Do I think they're condemned forever? So I think, you know, Paul's warning in chapter 11 for Christians to not become arrogant, I think is telling me, it's written for me. And so it took me a few years to realize that the reason why I was so adamant about finding out so-called the right faith was because I desperately needed some kind of assurance that I can hold on to. And then it took me a few more years to tell myself that actually it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. You know, it's okay to have a longing for something. That only makes me human. And I think God doesn't ask anything more from me than to be human. Talking about human, our life is short. You know, Abraham lived for 175 years. I want to be optimistic, but I don't know if 175 is realistic for me. But my point is that Abraham was willing to trust God on a promise that was way bigger than himself. And here I am just trying to figure out everything in my short lifetime. How foolish am I? But I think I do have one thing going for me that Abraham did not have, which is that, you know, here I am standing here, sitting here, and I can look back in the past few thousand years. I can see the ups and downs of Israel. I can see the promise fulfilled in Jesus. And I can see the mission by Paul to go gather up Abraham's children in all of the nations, and the same mission that has come to you and I today. So, you know, we have all these. We have come a long way. And Abraham did not get to see all these things except to hold on to a promise. So I think today, if I can somehow talk to Abraham, I think I would tell him, thank you. Thank you for putting your trust in your God. Because your God has delivered so much beyond your wildest imaginations. So I have no problem trusting your God, because your God is also my God. And I don't need to figure out everything in my lifetime. If only I can just be like you. I can just be like you, Abraham. If I can just do one or two things to help pass on this faith to the next generation, I think that will be enough for me.